So next, we are going to move on to a presentation from Google and Ipsos that will reveal the results of their research, which we hope can help brands motivate and encourage consumers to make more sustainable choices. Now, we're hoping to have some time at the end for questions. So we're using Slido today. If you're just joining us, if you've been with us yesterday, then you'll know how it all works. But we'd love to have your questions. And at the end, if we have time, I'll pop them to our speakers. So let me welcome Gerald Breatnach and Jessica Long to the stage. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see those of you that made it into the room. Well done. Not the easiest day to get here. And hello to everybody on the live stream. I'm Gerald Breatnach, as Geeta said, and I lead the Strategic Insights team at Google in the UK. And we bring together Google data analysis and commissioned research to try and answer questions around the topics that our clients care about.
I'm Jessica Long. I head up Ipsos's consulting practice in sustainability and ESG, so part of Strategy 3. I work with businesses and brands around the world to help them resolve their sustainability challenges.
And so why are we here? Well, Google's very proud to be a part of Ad Net Zero, and it builds on a long history of involvement in terms of sustainability. I mean, we heard yesterday around, from one of my colleagues, around Google's work, which focuses on leading at Google with our owned and operated activities and working towards being carbon-free 24/7 across our owned and our data centers and our campuses by 2030. Also, enabling everyone, so using our platforms and services to help people make more sustainable decisions, and then working with partners, and that's where this presentation fits in, because providing insight to our partners is a really key way we hope we can help people. And it comes out of conversations we've been having with marketing leadership in the UK. When we've been speaking to CMOs and others about sustainability, there really is a tension that comes through. So people absolutely, they know they need to support their business's sustainability strategy, and they want to support their business's sustainability strategy. But from a marketing leadership point of view, it's not always clear how to do that. There are questions around marketing effectiveness. There are concerns around greenwashing. And there are questions about how this should fit in alongside all of their other KPIs and responsibilities, and especially now, given the tough choices that businesses are making in the economic environment. So what we're going to run through today is some work that we've been doing with Ipsos over the last 6 months or so to really dig into this question, not whether businesses should be supporting driving their marketers should be driving the sustainability agenda, but really thinking about how you do that and how you do that based on where the UK citizens are right now.
Perfect. Thanks, Gerald. So if we look at this first slide, it's no secret that brands are feeling what I call the Python squeeze of sustainability at literally every angle. So from a regulatory standpoint, from governments around net zero, they're feeling pressure. From their investors and stakeholders, they're feeling pressured around ESG targets and milestones. We're even seeing net zero outcomes being leaked to executive pay. But what we're here to talk about today predominantly is about the consumer relationship and the consumer demand. 2 in 3 consumers say they want to make more sustainable choices, right? And actually, when we look at wider Ipsos data, concern for sustainability and the environment specifically is at an all-time high ever. Undeterred by the pandemic, undeterred by the cost of living crisis. So if we go to the next slide, what does that actually mean in practice? If they care now more than ever, shouldn't that be translating into behavior change? Well, really, when we look at other data over the last 7 years, and we break down specific sustainable actions, like taking shorter showers, changing out your light bulbs, whatever it might be, that has marginally shifted in 7 years. So why, if people care now more than ever, are they not actually taking the massive steps to achieve lower emissions and tackling the net zero challenge? This has led us to really focus on the say-do gap. You might hear that mentioned quite frequently in the last couple of days, or the discrepancy between what people do versus what they actually say. Some call it the values action gap, right? But this is a bit of a misnomer. It's a bit of a reductionist term. It unfairly puts the onus of responsibility on people themselves to behave differently, rather than looking beneath the surface at what marketers and brands can actually do to shift and nudge those behaviors. If we look beneath the surface of the say-do gap, we see things like shared responsibility. Fundamentally, people feel they're doing their fair share of the bargain. They're pulling their own weight. They want industry and government to lead. So we need to be mindful of that with our messaging. Knowledge and understanding. We can't really even agree on a framework for sustainability. ESG, SDGs, 3Ps, 5Ps, whatever it might be. Think about how confusing that must be as a consumer when you're seeing all these different messages. And then also paradox of choice. We just heard about what if every ad was a green ad? How are individuals meant to pick and choose which ones are relevant for them if they cannot possibly do them all? One of the CMOs that we spoke to had said, if we can't expect consumers to demand the change at the pace we need it to happen, then marketers need to drive that demand. And what's really exciting about that sentiment and that acknowledgement is that puts marketers at the epicenter of the sustainability and net zero challenge. Because marketers, as we've just seen, have a huge opportunity and responsibility to help close that behavior change gap. Now, this is more critical than ever. Looking in years past, over the past 15 years or so, historically, if you look to the far left, your far left, and the UK's net zero pathway has predominantly been focused around things happening in the background, moving away from coal in the gray box, with very little focus on behavior change itself, only around 13%. But moving forward, there's a recognition that if we're going to hit our targets, we need everyone on board, and we need mass societal behavior change. That's represented in the green box at the very top there. And then the one below it, that kind of pale green box, that's about innovation and behavior change and where the nexus of the two, where they both meet. Things like electric vehicles, switching to heat pumps, and moving away from gas boilers. That top bit is about wider actions like flying less, eating less meat, eating less dairy, for example. So where does this leave Brits in this grand scheme of the sustainability challenge? Well, we know people care, and we know they want to do what's right. Time and time again, in the focus groups that we conducted, in the depth interviews that we did, we saw literally across every generation a rising concern and even fear around what the impending climate crisis means for future generations, and this sense of eco-anxiety for younger generations, to the point where several of them are choosing even not to have children because they're not even convinced that what they're handing over in the world is something that's viable. And 8 in 10 Brits actually believe that we're headed for an environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. And this is more or less the same figure that we see across the globe. So this is not unique to the UK itself. This is a global sentiment as well. This is also reflected in our search data. So how people are using search terms, for example, and the frequency of the search term sustainability. When we see that when we track that over the trajectory of the last 5 years, we see that's risen over to 2 times greater than what it was back in 2018. Now, it's worth acknowledging, because I still hear this sometimes, that climate change and sustainability is not a trend. It is not going anywhere. It has remained undeterred by the pandemic. It has remained undeterred so far by the cost of living crisis. And we're seeing that nearly 8 in 10 people believe that climate change is just as important as the cost of living crisis. We have the same question was asked at the advent of the pandemic, and we had a similar result as well. Again, both within the UK and globally, there's an increasing recognition that this is a serious threat to our livelihoods as well. But what was particularly interesting around this question is it was asked in August at a peak time when there was already concern around the cost of living crisis and the cost of oil and energy. But it also was regardless of socioeconomic status, which is huge. So even if you're really struggling and you're at the bottom of the pyramid, there's still a recognition that climate change is just as significant and that we need to go ahead and prioritize this quickly. Now, we need to stop thinking about the economy and the environment as a dichotomy, right? Because actually the cost of living crisis can be a catalyst to accelerate behavior change. We're seeing that in search terms as well through the use of secondhand goods. Secondhand cars have gone up, searches for secondhand sofa sets, searches for secondhand wedding dresses, and even stores near me. So that is continuing to rise, and the stigma of secondhand has gone down with the rise of vintage, refurbished, recycled, right? Which is really quite exciting. Next slide. And we call that basically economics, right? But we need to also acknowledge that consumers are not necessarily willing to make trade-offs. They feel that they're doing enough, as I've mentioned before. They're pulling their own weight. So we can't expect them, oh, well, they're not willing to pay more, so it's the say-do gap. They must not really care. Well, they feel that they're doing more, but if you couch it within a co-benefit for them being something like greater value for money because it's less likely to deteriorate, planetary health, so less microplastics in your body because you're not using this product that has as much plastic or waste. So it's about pairing and looking for that edge of what is in it for the actual end user. But equally, we need to stop expecting them to bear that burden of friction and that change. So 1 in 3 people actually agree that sustainable products aren't well priced enough. But what's also quite interesting is that sustainability can be a casting vote, or rather a tiebreaker. If you have 2 products of equal value, relatively similar value rather, efficacy, convenience, quality, people would choose the more sustainable option. So we even saw that not even from a product level, but from a service level when we're looking at if they offered me the same interest rates, I'd choose the more sustainable one when it comes to finance. Next slide. So how do we drive behavior change? As marketers and the Advertising Association, how do we actually go ahead and leverage that? What do we do about this? Well, this is where Ipsos partnered with Google to speak to 45 different individuals in qualitative research, so focus interviews, depth interviews with people that have a range of sustainability behaviors and attitudes. We also looked at 16 different categories, and we validated our results across 1,700 UK adults. And 3 key insights that we're going to structure the rest of the presentation around emerged. One is there's a gap between the bigger picture and everyday actions. Yes, they care. They might recycle every day, but less than 9% of what you put in the recycling bin actually gets recycled. So obviously, there's a disconnect there. But marketers, as I've mentioned, have an integral role to play to help push that along. Number 2, the opportunities and challenge vary by category. We have to stop assuming that we have a one-size-fits-all approach to solving net zero. We need to begin to look at the category-specific relevances and tailor our strategy accordingly. And finally, building trust doesn't happen overnight. It's an ongoing journey, and it takes time, particularly in this climate, both literally and figuratively.
Thanks, Jess. So let's dig into the first one, which is this point that, as Jess has shared, people really do care, and it was fascinating watching the groups, and when people could especially see the relationship to their own lives, their own family, their children and their grandchildren. They care really, really deeply. And yet, when we look at what they're actually doing, whether that's speaking to them in the groups or through the quantitative work, they are focused on things that are relatively low effort, low risk, and least costly. We've got 85% of the UK population doing their recycling, great, but a quarter or less are doing things like eating mostly a plant-based diet or buying energy only from a renewable source in order to support sustainable actions. And when we probed into this, the thing that came out really clearly was just the complexity of this topic is overwhelming for people. 42%, when asked about different categories, said they didn't know what it meant for a brand to be sustainable. And after making a purchase, around 45% of people didn't know whether that purchase was sustainable or not. And who can blame them in a way? There are 87 and counting currently eco-labels in circulation in the UK. This is just a little snapshot. I'd be very impressed if anyone could name or explain all of these, and it's just a proportion of the ones that people are faced with out there in the real world. When we spoke to people in depth about different sectors, we got a really interesting pattern emerging, where they weren't feeling like they had enough information and they weren't able to connect between that sector and the bigger picture. So in things like retail, while people are doing the actions like recycling or their use of energy at home, when it comes to the products they buy, they don't feel like they've got enough information, and they don't know if that information is true. That's with physical products. It gets much more complicated when you move into services and the service sector. So thinking about the mobile industry, when we talk to people, they weren't very clear on the sector on this, but they kept coming back to the physical, which is thinking about handset recycling potentially. It's very hard to get people to think more broadly about the industry's energy usage, the impact of networks. When we tried actually on mobile networks, people went to talking about mobile masts and were they a blight on the landscape. Again, going to the physical thing that's right in front of them. It was really interesting that people find it very hard to get beyond that. Even clearer in banking. So in banking, we actually had one group where we were trying to discuss sustainable banking. And the focus group, I've never seen it in my career, the focus group just went silent. Nobody had anything to contribute about what it meant for a bank to be sustainable. And for everyone in this room or on the call who's been following COP and knows the role of finance in solving some of the world's enormous sustainability challenges, that might come as a surprise. But for most people, they do not make the link to financed emissions. They go back to the physical, paperless billing, recycle plastic in credit cards. Largely, people don't understand how finance works, let alone how finance can be sustainable. And that's a real challenge for businesses in the service sector. And because people have this knowledge gap, they do, as Jess said, feel like they're doing all they can already. For example, this person, I do all my recycling properly, I try not to buy things wrapped in plastic, I'm doing my part, what else can I do? They don't necessarily understand that there are more options available to them, and they certainly haven't got a way of prioritizing those options. And this, for me, is the biggest single opportunity for marketing. There is a huge gap between how people feel about the macro issue, and they really do care, and the micro actions that they're taking. There's almost a gap in the middle where they're missing the concepts to help them connect the actions that they can take and the actions that businesses can help them with the bigger picture. And when I talk to actual businesses about this topic, everybody in this room and on the call in your businesses has probably got a strategy that probably touches on climate, it possibly touches on biodiversity loss or water or social equity, these big themes that ladder your actions up to the big picture. But for most people out there in the real world, they haven't got that conceptual ladder between the micro actions and the macro picture. And that's where marketing can help, connecting those to motivate people and to drive behavioral change. And we're not going to go into a model of behavior change. People work with different ones. There's lots of them out there. But to simplify, we really think it comes down to enabling and engaging people. Enabling is about shaping and stretching buying behaviors, really thinking about the choice architecture, to use behavioral science term, and helping people just navigate towards the sustainable choices. And then engaging, which comes back to some of the work that Matt shared in the first presentation. Building knowledge, also sharing progress against ESG priorities, and helping people build that conceptual framework of what's important, how does it fit into the bigger picture. What could that look like? Well, in terms of enable, it's really about making it easy to find and choose the sustainable option. Talking about co-benefits, like Jess mentioned, not presenting this as an additional expense or an additional difficulty. Build it into your core offering and make sure it's being surfaced in such a way that it's being presented so people can choose it. UX is really important. We've done some great work with a retailer, a fashion retailer, looking at their returns, which, as you might know, is a big sustainability issue for fashion brands. By changing the UX, we were able to significantly reduce the number of returns coming back from those purchases. It was a good experience for the people using the website. It was a good economic experience for the business in that it cost less money with less returns coming through, and also it had a significant impact on sustainability. It's just thinking about where are those moments where you can enable a more sustainable choice and make that really easy for people. In terms of the language and the propositions that we've tested, you can't underestimate how much we need to make this simple and relatable to people and easy to understand, and anchoring any claims with real numbers that give people a sense of proportion. You know, how important is it to do this versus some of the options? And then engaging. A couple of thoughts on this is, where are the knowledge moments where you can build people's knowledge through the content that you can give to them, and help them with evidence and information when they're looking? And then in some categories, you've got a real opportunity for leadership here, sharing your progress, bringing consumers on that journey with you.
So the challenge and opportunities by category, and why is it important to talk about by every category and acknowledge that they're all different? Because they all have different levels of innovation, maturity, and understanding when it comes to sustainability itself. But what I want to talk to you about today is not just those things, but actually how consumers, how people relate to each one of these categories, because that's integral to getting your marketing strategy right. So one of the macro lessons we learned quite early on in our study was that sustainability is both more visible and more influential in product-led categories versus service-led categories. And that might be quite intuitive, but I'm going to go ahead and break that down a little bit for you in the following different examples here. So if we look at search terms just for a product-led category that's quite well established, like fashion, we see that the trajectory of search terms has evolved quite significantly and quite quickly over the last few years. It starts out quite vague, kind of what the heck is sustainability, and then we have a beginning introduction of sustainability plus category. Soon brands begin to appear. You know, we might see Nike, sustainability, and then we begin to see in the last couple of years more around product diversity. You know, sustainable swimwear, sustainable shoes, sustainable jackets and outerwear. But most recently, we're seeing not only brands becoming a proxy for the term sustainability itself, so sustainability isn't even mentioned, but we're also seeing differentiators and modifiers to help people navigate the plethora of different options out there, things like best or most affordable. When we translate that, or we rather compare that to a service-led category like finance, we see that the trajectory is quite a lot more condensed here and a lot less nuanced than we might expect. So things like funds might be mentioned, a couple products here and there, a couple brands are beginning to emerge, but really this category is quite nascent and quite behind by nature of it being a service-led category compared to the product-led category like fashion. But what would happen if we took all those 16 categories and we plotted them against the enable and engage proxies that Gerald mentioned earlier? Well, we did that. And we see here in the far left where people feel quite empowered in terms of, I know what it actually means to be sustainable, and I actually know what to do about it. So the x-axis here says, I find it easy to make a sustainable choice, and the y-axis here is, I don't know what it means in this category for brands to be sustainable. So here in the blue, we have things like home appliances, luxury fashion, cars and vehicles. Look around your house. Most of your white goods have an energy rating, right? Quite intuitive to read. It kind of almost mirrors the traffic signals, like the red, yellow, green kind of signals that you might see on food packaging. Automotive, not only do we have the regulatory pressures of phasing out petrol and diesel cars, but we also have ultra low emission zones that are kind of pushing that forward, and we have the prospect of the cost of living crisis pushing people towards electric vehicles, which is quite a stronger proposition. In the middle here, we have, so if you hit the clicker, the builds, they have the middle here is where most of our categories sit. So this is where people feel relatively knowledgeable about what it means to be sustainable in food and beverage and energy, and even personal electronics around refurbishments, but they find it really difficult to make choices. And that's to mention the 87 eco-labels, but also when you go there and you're not quite sure, why is my organic produce all wrapped in packaging, non-compostable, non-biodegradable packaging, but then if I buy loose stuff, it's maybe less better for me, maybe less better for the planet with pesticides, but actually it's in compostable packaging, or it's not even in any plastic at all. So this is all very difficult for people to have to discern. And if we go up to the far left here in the gray, these are his service-led ones, categories like insurance, broadband services, banking, mobile networks. This is quite a confusing space, even of itself, for consumers and people to navigate, let alone when you layer that on what it means to be sustainable. So fundamentally, in your strategies of enabling engaging, it's absolutely critical that you take a category lens, because they sit in the minds and the lives of individuals differently. And that lens is going to be critical in actually being able to have a successful behavior change campaign. Now, what does that mean in practice? From a service-led perspective, it means leveraging with education and transparency. True for all categories, yes. True specifically for service-led categories, because they don't have a tangible product that they can hold, touch, and feel in front of them to prove to them that it's sustainable. So that's also greater emphasis on service-led categories to lead. We've already talked about an expectation of industry standing up, but if they're not able to see the products that you're producing at the end of the day, they need to know what you're actually doing, and it needs to be shown in a very transparent manner. Sometimes you can have calls to actions or quantitative figures, if Gerald has suggested, to prove to them that you're actually moving forward and taking ownership in this space. Finally, leaning into owned and earned media to engage into sustainability, so leveraging your existing comms to communicate to your customers. Now, when it comes to product-led, it's a lot more difficult to differentiate in this space. Soon, we'll probably be hearing that everyone is net zero by 20, fill in the blank, right? It's no longer a differentiator. It's increasingly becoming ubiquitous and almost like a hygiene factor. But there is a great opportunity to differentiate. There's also potential to stretch existing buying behaviors, going into refillables, meat-free Mondays. How can we leverage and grow what they're already doing, existing behaviors? And then test paid media channels with sustainability messaging. Can sustainability comms be used to drive brand choice?
So the third insight area really builds on some of what we were talking about in terms of trust, and the fact that building trust is a journey, and people are not all starting from the same starting point. There's an Ipsos segmentation of the UK population, and anyone in this room, I would hazard a guess, is probably up in the top 16% in terms of wanting to do as much as you can and frankly quite knowledgeable. But that is not representative of the population, let's be honest. And what we found speaking to people and in our interviews with them is that there's a relationship between their knowledge levels and their confidence, and the less knowledge and the less confidence, the more likely they are to be cynical about brands in particular, and cynical about sustainability, and get disengaged. And so we heard quite a lot of comments like, are brands doing enough? Is it just lip service? Greenwashing wasn't really a phrase that people used out in the real world. It's more of an industry phrase, but they've got a kind of hunch that something's going on, and they don't necessarily feel very good about it. Almost half don't know how to tell if a brand's claim is truthful. But the good news is that during the process of doing this research, we interviewed people at the beginning, we ran focus groups, we interviewed them at the end. From every part of that segmentation, we saw people moving on a journey. People are not entrenched in these positions. And actually, the more they learn, the more they care, the more actions they take, the more they learn. It's a really, really, it's a journey with steps. And I think the implication here for marketers is to really understand where your audience is and chunk it down for them. And don't just think about engaging them with information. It's that point around enabling them as well. Combine small steps based on where they are now, small steps with more information, with another small step with more information. And we really think we'll be able to see significant progress, and that there's no one out there that should be left out of this. So to summarize, one final point is just about underpinning everything with transparency and accuracy. We haven't really touched on it in this presentation, but I know the presentations yesterday from the ASA and CMA cover this in depth, and it's absolutely critical that we don't lose people's trust by emphasizing one area of E, S, and G and then falling down on another. It's kind of taken as a given that you are walking the walk before you start talking the talk. But once you're ready, it's all about engaging and enabling to try and close that gap between the micro actions that people can take and the bigger picture, understanding your category differences so that you understand what's going to work for your specific type of category, especially whether it's a service or a product category. Making sure you're starting from the right starting point with audience attitudes and that segmentation. And then, as I've said, underpinning everything with transparency and accuracy. Now, this is a starting point for us. We are really keen to engage, to get feedback. Feel free to contact Jess or me if you want to discuss anything further or give some feedback on the work. We're really, really keen. I suspect this work will evolve and keep us busy for a long time yet. And I'm not sure we're going to have time for any questions, but Gita, back to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gerald. Thank you, Jessica. That was absolutely brilliant. And to be honest, I'm glad we took up the time so that we could really hear what your findings are. We have run out of time for questions, but thank you so much for presenting at our summit today.